In the stillness of night, when sleep drifts just beyond reach, stories become companions. Not stories of fantasy, but of memory, echoes carried from the past into our restless present. Tonight, we turn to one such echo, the Amritsar Massacre, a colonial bloodbath. This is not only a chapter of 1919, not only the sound of rifles in a walled garden, it is the silence that followed, the grief of families, the wound that etched itself into generations. History here is not a collection of facts, it is sorrow remembered, dignity betrayed, and lessons that still whisper to us across the years. So let your breathing slow, let your thoughts soften, and stay with us. For in void histories, we do not rush through the past. We walk gently through it, listening to what remains and finding in its shadows the quiet truths that still shape our world today. The Amritsar Massacre, a colonial bloodbath. Before the sound of gunfire echoed in a garden of stone walls, before fear and betrayal left an open wound upon a nation's soul, India was a land steeped in rhythm and quiet continuity. To picture it is to imagine mornings in Punjab, where the mist hangs low over golden fields of wheat, where the rising sun spreads warmth slowly across the earth, and where the voices of villagers begin the day in harmony with temple bells and the call to prayer. Life, though marked by hardship, carried within it a deep balance. Families bound by tradition, communities woven together by festivals of light and harvest, songs that rose in the evening like soft prayers carried into the night. India's soul was vast, and in its heart, Punjab pulsed with vitality. Its fields fed millions, its rivers carried stories as old as the mountains, and its people were known for courage, resilience, and generosity. The land was alive with color. Saris dyed with indigo and saffron, bazaars bustling with spice and cloth, streets filled with the fragrance of cardamom tea. Each life was a thread, woven carefully into the larger fabric of community. To live was to belong. To belong was to remember. And to remember was to keep alive the songs of ancestors. And in Amritsar, the holy city, the golden temple glimmered across the waters of its sacred pool, reflecting devotion and continuity. Pilgrims arrived in quiet reverence, carrying not just offerings but hopes and burdens, whispering prayers into the still air. The city was more than a place of trade or devotion. It was a living memory, a heartbeat of culture and spirit. To walk its narrow streets was to feel centuries of footsteps beneath your own, as if time itself had slowed to let you listen. But even in these days of peace, shadows lingered at the edges. The British had come long before, first as traders, then as rulers, and their presence pressed more heavily with each passing decade. Yet before the storm fully arrived, life still carried its ordinary rhythms. Children laughed as they chased one another through courtyards, women sang softly while grinding spices, men worked in fields with the patience of those who believed the earth would always provide. For them, time stretched wide, like the fields beneath the sky, promising continuity. In the evenings, families gathered by dim lantern light, listening as elders retold old epics, the stories of gods and heroes, of devotion and sacrifice, of kingdoms risen and fallen. These stories were not only entertainment, they were mirrors of endurance, teaching patience, courage, and faith. The young listened with wide eyes, falling asleep to the sound of voices that seemed as ancient as the stars. It was in these quiet nights that the people carried forward the essence of who they were, unbroken, unhurried, deeply rooted. Yet history, like the monsoon, always shifts. The skies can change in moments, clouds gathering where once the air was clear. And in India, the gathering clouds were not of rain, but of rule. Foreign laws, unfamiliar tongues, and the tightening grip of authority that grew stronger with every passing year. Still, in this first part of the story, before Amritsar became a name whispered with grief, there was harmony. The land breathed deeply. The people carried their faith like a lantern in the dark, and hope, though fragile, still lingered in the air, unbroken by what was yet to come. And so, as we rest in this picture of India before the wound, let us listen carefully to the heartbeat of the land, the sound of temple bells, the laughter of children, the songs of farmers in their fields. For soon the rhythm will falter, the harmony will tremble, and the shadows that lingered at the edge will step fully into the center of history. The story will change, and the people will face trials that will carve sorrow into memory. But before the storm, there is always calm, and it is here, in this calm, that our telling begins. The first touch of change came not as a roar, but as a whisper, quiet, steady, almost unnoticeable at first. The British did not arrive as conquerors immediately. They came under the banner of trade. Ships appeared along the coasts, their sails white against the horizon, carrying men in strange clothing and speaking in foreign tongues. They sought spices, textiles, and precious goods, and in return, they offered coins and promises of prosperity. To many, they were curious guests, travelers whose presence felt small against the vastness of India's culture and the weight of its ancient traditions. But time would reveal that these guests had no intention of leaving. At first, their presence was tolerated, even welcomed in certain courts, for India was no stranger to trade. For centuries, merchants from Arabia, Persia, and beyond had passed through its markets, exchanging goods and ideas. Yet the British were different. They were not content to pass through. They sought to remain, to plant roots, to claim authority. Forts began to rise where once there had only been caravans, and soldiers marched where merchants had once walked. Slowly, subtly, the balance shifted. The East India Company became more than a trading power. It became a ruler, its officials dictating laws and demanding taxes from people who had never before bowed to such authority. The wealth of India began to flow outward, not inward. Cotton was shipped away to distant factories, while the weavers of Bengal found themselves broken by poverty. Fields that had once fed villages were forced to grow crops, demanded by foreign markets, leaving farmers hungry in their own land. What had once been abundance began to feel like scarcity, not by failure of the soil, but by the draining of its fruits across oceans. For the people of Punjab, the presence of these foreigners carried with it a quiet unease. At first, life in the villages continued with familiar rhythms, harvests, prayers, festivals, but beneath the surface, change pressed heavily. Taxes grew harsher, laws became unfamiliar, and soldiers, foreign in face and tongue, patrolled the streets. Families whispered of injustice, of promises made and broken, of leaders who no longer answered to their people, but to distant rulers across the sea. The discontent grew slowly, like cracks in stone. Petitions were written, voices raised in assemblies, gatherings held in marketplaces and gardens. The people asked not for war, but for fairness. They asked for dignity, for their voices to be heard. Yet each petition was met with silence, or worse, with suspicion. The British administration did not see peaceful protest as dialogue. They saw it as defiance. And where they saw defiance, they answered with force. This response carried with it a sting deeper than punishment. It was betrayal. For during the Great War, thousands of Indians, many from Punjab, had been called upon to fight under the British flag. They left their families, their fields, and their homes, believing that loyalty would earn respect, that sacrifice abroad would bring freedom at home. They fought in the trenches of Europe. They shed blood on battlefields far from the plains of India. And when they returned, weary and hopeful, they were not met with gratitude, but with new chains. The Rowlatt Acts. These laws were harsh, allowing imprisonment without trial, silencing voices before they could even speak. It was as if the gift for loyalty was not freedom, but fear. Across the land, people felt the sting of betrayal more keenly than ever before, and in Amritsar, the heart of Punjab, discontent turned into determination. The people resolved to gather, to speak, to protest, not with violence, but with the same peaceful insistence that had carried them before. It is here, in this quiet turning, that the story bends toward its tragic heart. The conflict was no longer only about trade or about taxes, but about dignity itself, about whether a people could be silenced in their own land. In the courtyards of Amritsar, in the narrow streets, in the gardens surrounded by walls, the seeds of resistance began to take root. And though the people came with peaceful intentions, the shadow of the empire grew restless, unable to tolerate even silence turned into protest. And so, as we leave this chapter of beginnings, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a garden where men and women will soon gather, carrying not weapons but hope. They believe they will be heard. They believe their voices joined together will mean something. But history, heavy with cruelty, has already prepared another answer. The air grows still, the stage is set, and the silence before the storm deepens. Resistance in India did not begin with the sound of guns. It began with voices, quiet at first, but steady, like the murmur of a river that grows louder as it flows. Farmers, students, merchants, and laborers all felt the weight of injustice pressing upon their lives, and they began to gather, not with weapons, but with words and with silence. They protested in ways that were peaceful, yet powerful, standing together in meetings, writing petitions, raising their hands not to strike, but to demand fairness. In Amritsar and beyond, the air grew thick with a yearning that could no longer be contained. The yearning for dignity, for freedom, for the right to breathe without fear. The protests were not born out of sudden rage. They were born out of years of betrayal. The people remembered the promises whispered to them when their sons were sent to fight in foreign wars. They remembered the sacrifices, the lives lost in distant trenches, the hope that their loyalty would be honored. Yet when the soldiers came home, the only reward was repression, new laws that bound them tighter than before. The Rowlatt Acts were not just laws. They were chains, invisible yet heavy, stripping away the very idea of justice. To be arrested without trial, to be silenced without reason, this was not protection, but control. The people of Punjab could not accept such indignity. They began to gather in gardens and courtyards, in mosques and temples, in open squares where their voices might be heard. Leaders spoke softly but firmly, urging non-violence, reminding the people that strength need not come from bloodshed, but from unity. And so the protests grew, not wild, not reckless, but deliberate, a quiet defiance that unsettled the empire more deeply than any battle might have. For what the British feared was not violence, it was awakening. Yet even peaceful defiance carried risk. Soldiers patrolled the streets, their rifles gleaming under the sun, their presence a reminder of power that watched every move. Families walked to gatherings with both courage and fear in their hearts, unsure if they would return home safely. Mothers held their children closer, fathers spoke in hushed tones of what might come. Still, they came, drawn not by anger alone, but by the unshakable belief that silence in the face of injustice was no longer possible. In Amritsar, the people turned their eyes toward Jallianwala Bagh, a public garden surrounded by high walls and narrow entrances. It became a place where voices could join, where fear could be met with courage, where injustice could be answered with peaceful unity. As the spring of 1919 unfolded, men and women, elders and children, began to fill its open space, carrying their hopes as offerings to the air. They were not rebels with weapons, but ordinary people with ordinary dreams. Dreams of freedom, of safety, of dignity for themselves and their children. The British officials, however, did not see them as dreamers or petitioners. They saw them as threats. To them, a gathering of voices was a rebellion waiting to ignite, a challenge to authority that could not be tolerated. Suspicion hardened into fear, and fear hardened into cruelty. Orders were whispered, troops were stationed, and the empire prepared to answer the cry for freedom, not with dialogue, but with silence, the silence of guns. And so, the struggle that had begun with voices reached its first tragic climax. The people, unaware of the fate that awaited them, continued to gather, their numbers swelling, their faith holding them steady. They believed their protest would be heard, that justice might finally stir awake. They believed in the power of peace to overcome the weight of empire, but the empire believed in something else, the power of force to crush the spirit of a people. And as we leave this chapter of resistance and first struggles, we stand on the threshold of the garden. The sun hangs low over Amritsar, the air still warm with hope, and the voices of thousands rise together in unity. Yet behind the walls, soldiers prepare, rifles loaded, orders given. The people sing of justice, unaware that the echo they will soon hear is not reply, but the thunder of gunfire. The story moves forward, and the shadow deepens. The years leading to Amritsar carried with them a strange mixture of hope and despair. India had given much to the British Empire, its soldiers, its resources, its loyalty in times of war. Families in Punjab had sent their sons across oceans to fight in lands they had never seen, under a flag that was not their own. They believed, perhaps naively, that such sacrifice would earn respect, that their blood spilled on foreign battlefields would awaken gratitude in the hearts of their rulers. And when the war ended, many returned with that fragile hope flickering within them, the belief that a new dawn of fairness might finally come. But the dawn did not bring light. Instead, it brought the Rowlatt Acts, laws that stretched the shadows deeper. These laws allowed the arrest of anyone suspected of dissent, imprisonment without trial, and the silencing of voices before they had even spoken. For the people, it was not only betrayal, it was humiliation. After years of loyalty, they were rewarded not with freedom, but with chains. The ink on these laws might have been fresh, but for the Indian people, the betrayal was already centuries old. In Amritsar, the weight of these laws pressed heavily. The streets that once carried the hum of markets now carried whispers of fear. Neighbors wondered who might be arrested, who might vanish overnight into prisons without justice. The gathering places of the city, mosques, temples, gardens, became sanctuaries of both courage and risk. People still came together, for their voices longed to be heard, but every gathering carried the shadow of soldiers. Each word spoken in public became dangerous. Each step into a meeting place felt like walking a narrow line between freedom and silence. And yet, in that silence, determination grew stronger. The people of Punjab, proud and resilient, chose not to retreat into fear. They gathered in greater numbers, their protests peaceful but insistent. They wanted to remind the world that dignity could not be outlawed, that justice could not be erased with ink upon paper. At Jallianwala Bagh, a garden surrounded by high walls, families began to gather in the spring of 1919. They came not with weapons, but with hope. Men, women, and children, some carrying food, some carrying banners, many carrying nothing at all but the courage to stand together. The British administration, however, looked upon these gatherings with suspicion that bordered on paranoia. To them, every peaceful assembly was not a plea for justice, but a potential spark of rebellion. They could not imagine that ordinary people might gather simply to speak, to share grief, to demand dignity without violence. Fear distorted their vision, and in that distortion, cruelty found its foothold. General Reginald Dyer, the officer in command, saw the gathering not as voices calling for fairness, but as a threat to authority. He believed that fear could be stronger than freedom, that violence could silence the rising tide of protest. And so, while families sat in the garden, while children played near their parents, while voices prepared to rise together in peaceful demand, soldiers were stationed at the entrance. The gates, narrow and few, became traps rather than paths of safety. It was a moment heavy with unspoken tension. The people unaware of what awaited, the soldiers waiting for orders, the city itself holding its breath. Those who came to Jallianwala Bagh that day carried only the belief that their presence mattered, that gathering together would show the strength of their unity. They did not know that they were stepping into history, into a place where betrayal would turn into bloodshed, where hope would be met with horror. The promises of fairness had been broken, the faith in justice betrayed. The struggle, once marked by peaceful petitions, was now approaching a tragedy that would scar not only Punjab, but the very soul of India. And so, as this chapter of continuing struggles and broken promises fades, we stand at the threshold of the garden itself. The air grows heavy with expectation. Families sit in the dust, banners flutter softly in the breeze, children tug at their mothers' hands. It feels for a moment like an ordinary gathering of hope. And yet, behind the gates, rifles wait. Soldiers stand ready, and the silence before the storm deepens into something unbearable. The story is about to break, and history will never be the same again. On the afternoon of April 13th, 1919, the garden of Jallianwala Bagh was alive with the quiet murmur of thousands. Men sat cross-legged on the ground, listening for speeches of protest. Mothers carried children on their hips. Vendors moved through the crowd with water and food. The air was heavy, but it was filled with hope more than fear. People believed they were gathering for a cause larger than themselves, a cause of dignity, of justice. They did not imagine that within moments the open space would be drenched in grief. When General Dyer gave his order, the rifles rose as if lifted by the same hand. The sound of gunfire cracked the air, sharp and merciless, echoing again and again against the high stone walls. The crowd, trapped within narrow gates, had nowhere to flee. Panic spread like fire, but the walls allowed no escape. Mothers shielded their children with their own bodies. Elders stumbled to the ground, unable to move swiftly. The bullets did not distinguish between the old and the young, the innocent and the bold. For 10 long minutes, gunfire rained upon the gathering until the cries of the living dissolved into silence. When it ended, Jallianwala Bagh was no longer a garden. It was a grave. Bodies lay strewn across the dusty earth. Pools of blood darkened the ground where moments before children had played. Survivors huddled in terror, many wounded, many searching desperately for loved ones who would not rise again. In the aftermath, the silence was not peace. It was shock, an unbearable stillness where voices had been. For the people of Punjab, the massacre was more than the loss of hundreds of lives. It was the shattering of trust, the tearing apart of innocence. Families who had sent sons to war for the empire now buried them in their own city, killed not by enemies from abroad, but by soldiers meant to keep order. Children who survived grew up with memories of screams and gunfire burned into their minds, carrying invisible scars that shaped their futures. The wound of Amritsar seeped into every household. Mothers wept through the nights, fathers carried the weight of helplessness, and entire villages mourned together. The trauma did not vanish with time, it passed forward, carried into the hearts of those who came after. It became part of stories whispered to children, not as bedtime tales, but as warnings of the cruelty of power, of the fragility of peace, of the cost of silence. Generations who followed bore this burden in ways both quiet and profound. Many grew with a sense of absence, a grandfather missing, an aunt lost, an elder whose wisdom should have guided them but whose voice had been silenced. These absences shaped their lives, like shadows stretching across time. Others inherited fear, a fear of gathering, of speaking too loudly, of trusting too easily. Trauma, like memory, lingers long after the moment has passed, and yet, even within this sorrow, seeds of resilience remained. The massacre did not silence the desire for freedom, it deepened it. The loss at Jallianwala Bagh awakened a generation to the reality that colonial rule would not yield to loyalty or petition. It showed them that peaceful voices could be met with violence, but it also showed them that the spirit of a people could not be erased by bullets. Leaders rose from this wound, movements grew stronger, and the call for independence rang louder across the land. The cost was unbearable, but the fire it lit carried forward. Still, for the families who lived through it, the pain was not political, it was human. A mother's empty arms, a child's unanswered questions, an elder's silent grief. These were the true costs, the quiet sorrows that history books cannot hold. The Amritsar Massacre left scars that shaped not just a nation's struggle, but the private worlds of countless families, shaping how they dreamed, how they trusted, how they remembered. And so, as we drift from this chapter heavy with sorrow, we carry with us the image of that garden, once a place of gathering, now forever a place of mourning. The cries of the lost still echo in the silence of its walls, and the grief of that day still breathes through generations. Yet within the silence, too, lies resilience. The people endured, their memory endured. From the shadow of tragedy rose a brighter flame of determination. As we move into the final reflection, we must hold both truths: the sorrow of lives stolen, and the strength of a people who refuse to let those lives be forgotten. History, when it is remembered with care, is more than a list of names and dates. It is a whisper that travels across time, carrying the weight of lives lived, of sorrows endured, of lessons waiting quietly to be heard. The Amritsar Massacre of 1919 is one such whisper. It is not only the story of a single day or a single place, it is the story of a wound cut deep into the soul of a nation, a wound that still breathes, still aches, more than a century later. For the people of Punjab, Amritsar was never only about the numbers, the hundreds who fell, the many more who were wounded. It was about the broken trust, the betrayal that shattered the fragile hope of fairness. It was about families left empty, about children growing up with shadows where their parents should have stood. And for India as a whole, it became a symbol, a turning point where the dream of freedom no longer seemed like a distant idea, but a necessity, urgent and undeniable. When we reflect upon that day, we cannot simply imagine the gunfire or the soldiers' rifles. We must imagine the silence that followed. The silence of mothers holding lifeless children. The silence of fathers carrying the weight of helplessness. The silence of the city itself, stunned into stillness by the cruelty it had witnessed. That silence is as much a part of the story as the bullets. Because it was within that silence that memory began to take root, and within that silence that generations found their determination. To remember Amritsar is to remember that power, when unchecked, can devour innocence. It is to remember that violence, when used to silence, only awakens deeper voices in the long run. The massacre was meant to instill fear, but instead it sowed seeds of resolve. From its ashes rose a stronger independence movement, one that carried the voices of those who had fallen. Their blood became a message, not of defeat, but of unfinished struggle. And yet, it is important to pause here, not only to honor the resilience, but to honor the grief itself. Too often, history moves quickly to the triumphs, to the victories that follow tragedy. But for the families who lived through Amritsar, triumph did not erase sorrow. No independence, no flag, no future could bring back the mothers, fathers, and children who were lost in the garden that day. Their absence remained, echoing across time. To reflect honestly is to carry both truths at once, the sorrow of loss and the strength of survival. Even now, Jallianwala Bagh stands as a place of memory. Visitors walk its pathways in silence, their footsteps soft upon the earth, their eyes lingering on the bullet holes that still scar the walls. The garden blooms again with flowers, but beneath the blossoms lies the shadow of that day. It is a reminder that history does not vanish. It waits, it breathes, it asks us to listen. The massacre is not only India's memory, it is a lesson for humanity, a reminder of what happens when power forgets compassion, when fear eclipses dialogue, when dignity is denied. As you listen tonight, let the story rest within you, not as noise, but as reflection. Let it be a gentle reminder that the past is never fully gone. It lingers in our choices, in our silences, in the ways we treat one another. The Amritsar Massacre whispers to us still, asking not for vengeance, but for remembrance, for empathy, for the wisdom to choose differently in our own time. And so, as this long telling comes to its close, imagine the garden under moonlight. The walls stand quiet, the flowers stir in the night air, and the echoes of voices long silent seem to hover gently, like prayers carried by the wind. The people are gone, but their memory remains. The sorrow is heavy, but within it lies a call to compassion. The night deepens, but the story lingers, a quiet companion to your thoughts. Sleep if you can, with the knowledge that even in tragedy there is endurance, even in silence there is memory, and even in wounds there can be wisdom. This was the story of the Amritsar Massacre, a colonial bloodbath, yes, but also a lesson that still whispers across the years, asking us to remember and to carry its echo gently into tomorrow.